Ethan Carter, a dedicated reformer in law enforcement, finds himself unjustly stopped by Officer Hank Redding during a rainy night, with the officer, U-2019's behavior steeped in intimidation and racial bias. What begins as a baseless stop escalates into a blatant abuse of power. With Redding rifling through Ethan's trunk under false pretenses, the encounter exposes systemic misconduct, shedding light on the unchecked racism and authoritarian behavior within the department. As Ethan challenges Redding U-2019's actions, the balance of power shifts, forcing a confrontation that underscores the urgent need for accountability and justice in law enforcement. Under a gray, misty sky, Ethan Carter carefully navigated Willow Avenue, the rain streaking his windshield in erratic patterns. His wipers swished back and forth in a valiant but futile battle against the persistent drizzle. The weight of an exhausting day pulled heavily on him, his thoughts preoccupied with the allure of a hot shower and blissful solitude. Suddenly, a burst of red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, slicing through the gloom. A familiar wave of unease coursed through him as he sighed and slowed the car to a halt on the wet, glistening roadside. Ethan's fingers instinctively gripped the steering wheel at the prescribed 10 and 2 position. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, a precaution born not from paranoia but necessity. His record was clean. No speeding, no broken taillights, no overdue registration. Yet here he was, again. The uncomfortable thought bubbled up unbidden. Another night. Another unjustified stop. A police cruiser eased behind him, and its driver stepped out, boots crunching against the rain-soaked pavement. Officer Hank Redding emerged, a tall man with a broad frame that seemed to radiate dominance. Without so much as a polite greeting, he barked, "License and registration." His voice was curt, his tone sharp as a blade. Ethan offered a restrained smile. "Good evening, Officer May. I ask why I was pulled over?" His voice was measured, calm despite the simmering irritation beneath. "Driving too slow," Redding replied, squinting at Ethan as though he were an unsolved puzzle. "Looks suspicious." Ethan blinked in disbelief. Suspiciously slow. "It's raining pretty hard," he explained, keeping his voice level despite the absurdity of the accusation. Redding leaned closer to the window, his hat dripping beads of water. "Rain, huh? Or maybe you're being careful for another reason. Got something in the car you don't want me to see?" The insinuation hung in the air like a foul odor. Ethan forced himself to maintain his composure. "No, sir, everything's in order." Carefully, he retrieved his license and registration, handing them over. Redding snatched the documents and stomped back to his cruiser without another word, leaving Ethan in tense silence. The rain drummed on the roof of the car as Ethan watched the officer through his side mirror. Redding lingered in his vehicle longer than necessary, a deliberate move designed to unsettle Ethan. Recognized the tactic but refused to let his unease show. He adjusted his posture and took a deep breath, though the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. When Redding finally emerged, his demeanor was noticeably more rigid, as if disappointment from an unproductive search fueled his irritation. Approaching the car again, his voice cut through the drizzle. "Step out of the vehicle." Ethan frowned, his tone polite but firm. "May I ask the reason for this, officer?" "I said step out," Redding repeated, his words now edged with menace. Suppressing a sigh, Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt and climbed out, the chill of the rain immediately soaking through his jacket. He stood beside his car, his hands visible, his movements deliberate. The rain poured around them, amplifying the tension. "Open the trunk," Redding ordered, gesturing toward the rear of the vehicle. Ethan's jaw tightened. "With respect, officer, I believe you need a warrant for that," he replied, his tone firm but devoid of aggression. He knew the law and wasn't about to let his rights be trampled. Redding's lips curled into a smirk, the kind that made Ethan's stomach twist. "You've got it wrong. I can do whatever I see fit," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "No, you can't," Ethan shot back, his resolve solid. "You're violating my rights." The officer ignored him entirely, marching to the trunk like a man possessed. With a clatter of keys, he forcibly popped it open, the sound echoing ominously in the stormy night. Ethan's protests went unheard. The scene felt surreal as Ethan watched Redding rummage through the trunk's contents, his behavior almost gleefully invasive. But then, something shifted. Redding's smugness evaporated, replaced by a flicker of unease as his hand paused over a sleek black briefcase nestled neatly in the corner. His eyes narrowed, his expression hardening into something far more sinister. "What's this?" Redding demanded, gesturing toward the case. "It's personal property," Ethan replied, a hint of defiance creeping into his voice. "And it's none of your concern." Redding's face darkened as he reached for the case, his movements almost predatory. The rain intensified, a cold, unrelenting cascade that mirrored the dread rising in Ethan's chest. "You don't have the authority to open that," Ethan protested, his voice firm, though the pounding of his heart betrayed his growing anxiety. The officer's smirk returned, but this time it carried a sinister edge. "We'll see about that." He snapped open the briefcase, his gaze darting to its contents. What he saw made him hesitate, his confident demeanor faltering. Ethan's frustration gave way to a mix of anger and fear as the confrontation took a sudden, unpredictable turn. What had begun as an abuse of power now threatened to spiral into something far more dangerous. The officer's gaze fixed on the sleek black briefcase tucked neatly in the corner of the trunk. For a moment, his bravado faltered, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. "What's this?" Redding asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "That's personal property," Ethan replied firmly, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "You have no right to touch it." But Redding ignored him, his fingers already closing around the handle. He lifted the briefcase with a self-satisfied smirk, as if it were the piece of evidence he'd been hoping to find. "Let's see what you're hiding," he muttered, more to himself than to Ethan. "Put it down," Ethan said, his tone calm but resolute. His pulse quickened, each beat a drum roll of anticipation. Redding, undeterred, popped the latches with a decisive click and flipped the case open with theatrical flair. But as his eyes scanned the first document inside, his confidence crumbled. The color drained from his face, leaving him ashen. He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting over the bold letters at the top of the page. Notice of termination. Beneath the heading, his own name, Hank Redding, was printed in stark, unmistakable text, followed by a detailed list of his offenses, each one damning. Ethan crossed his arms and leaned casually against the car, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "What's wrong, Officer Redding?" he asked, his voice tinged with amusement. "Find something interesting?" Redding's hands trembled as he held the document closer, his eyes scanning it in disbelief. The smug arrogance he had worn so confidently moments ago was nowhere to be found. Instead, confusion and terror overtook his features as the weight of the revelation sank in. This can't be real," he stammered, his voice a broken whisper. "What the hell is this?" Ethan straightened, his calm demeanor unwavering as he locked eyes with the officer. "That, Officer Redding," he said slowly, each word cutting like a blade, "is an official document, and just so we're clear, you're holding it without permission." Redding's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His panic was palpable, his confidence completely shattered. You can't be serious," he choked out, his voice tinged with desperation. "Oh, I'm very serious," Ethan replied, stepping closer. "Now, if you're finished violating my property, I suggest you put it back. Unless, of course, you'd like to add another offense to that list." Redding's eyes darted back to the document, his breath shallow as he struggled to process the implications. The balance of power had shifted so completely that he now seemed smaller, diminished by the weight of his own exposed wrongdoing. The rain continued to fall, each drop punctuating the tense silence as Ethan waited, arms crossed, watching the officer unravel before him. Ethan's calm demeanor never wavered as he crossed his arms, his eyes fixed on Redding. "Oh, I'm very serious," Ethan said, his voice steady and sharp. "You see, I was brought in to clean up this department. Chief McAllister thought it was time to address officers like you, and guess what?" He let the pause hang in the air. Your name was right at the top of my list." Redding's jaw clenched as his eyes darted back to the document in his trembling hands. His mind raced to process the implications. "Wait. You're not—" "That's right," Ethan interrupted, his tone sharp. "I'm your new supervisor, and congratulations. You've just given me first-hand proof of why you're unfit to wear that badge." Redding's shoulders sagged, and his knees seemed to buckle slightly. The arrogance he had carried mere minutes ago was now replaced with raw terror. "Look, this is a misunderstanding," he began, his voice shaking. "I didn't know." "And that makes it okay?" Ethan snapped, his voice rising with authority. "You think it's acceptable to violate someone's rights just because you didn't know who they were? Tell me, Redding, if I weren't your boss, would you still think your actions tonight were justified?" Redding opened his mouth, but no words came. His silence was deafening, and Ethan's presence seemed to tower over him, filling the space with unrelenting intensity. Ethan stood firm, arms crossed, as Redding's composure crumbled further. The once imposing officer now looked like a man grasping at straws, his confidence utterly shattered. "Look," Redding stammered again, his voice unsteady. "This is all just a misunderstanding. I didn't mean anything by it. I didn't know who you were." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his gaze piercing. "And that's supposed to make it okay?" He shot back, his tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "You think it's acceptable to pull someone over for no reason, violate their rights, and rummage through their private property just because you didn't know they were your boss? Tell me, Redding, what if I weren't? Would you have treated me any differently?" Redding's eyes dropped to the ground, his boots shuffling in the rain as though he might find answers in the puddles forming at his feet. But Ethan wasn't about to let him off the hook. "How many times have you pulled this kind of stunt?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising with righteous anger. "How many people have you harassed or humiliated because you thought you could get away with it? How many didn't have a document in their trunk that forced you to backpedal?" Redding's lips parted, but whatever response he was about to offer faltered and died in his throat. Ethan leaned in slightly, his voice lowering but no less commanding. "That's what I thought," he said coldly. "You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught." "Please," Redding said, his tone now desperate. "I didn't mean anything by it. This job, it's all I have. I made a mistake, okay? But I can learn. I can change." Ethan let the officer's words hang in the air, the rain pouring around them, drenching them both. He didn't care about the cold or discomfort. This wasn't about the weather. It was about accountability, something Redding had evaded for far too long. "You want to change?" Ethan finally said, his voice steady and deliberate. "Then prove it, but not in my department." Redding's face crumpled like a discarded piece of paper, his desperation morphing into despair. "You can't do this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I need this job." "No," Ethan corrected him, his tone sharp and unforgiving. "What you needed was a wake-up call. Consider this it." The weight of Ethan's words hit Redding like a freight train, leaving the officer paralyzed, the document still clutched in his trembling hands. For the first time, it seemed he understood that there was no escape from the consequences he had set in motion. Ethan pulled out his phone, his expression calm but resolute. Redding stood frozen, pale and desperate. "Please," Redding stammered, his voice cracking under the strain. "You don't have to do this. I can fix this." Ethan let out a dry, humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "Apologize?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief and sarcasm. "Tell me something, Redding. How many people have you apologized to after pulling a stunt like this? Or is this the first time you've been caught?" Redding's silence was all the confirmation Ethan needed. Without another word, Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed. The line clicked, and Chief McAllister's voice answered almost immediately. "Chief, it's Ethan," he said, his tone steady and resolute. "I've got Officer Redding with me, effective immediately. He's terminated. Notify HR and expedite the paperwork." Redding's eyes widened in sheer panic, his hands falling limply to his sides as the words sank in. Wait, he stammered, his voice cracking. You don't have to do this. Please, I'll do whatever it takes. Ethan raised a hand, cutting him off. It's done, Redding. Pack your things and turn in your badge and gun by the end of the day. And don't even think about appealing, your record speaks for itself. The phone call ended with a sharp click. Ethan pocketed his phone and turned back to Redding, who stood frozen in disbelief. Here's a tip, Ethan said, stepping closer, his voice cutting through the relentless rain. If anyone's ever foolish enough to give you another uniform, remember what it's supposed to stand for. Protect and serve, not harass and intimidate. Redding remained silent, drenched and defeated, as Ethan leaned into the trunk, retrieved the briefcase, and snapped it shut. The rain continued its steady downpour, but for Ethan, there was a sense of clarity, a rare victory against the tide of systemic abuse. As he closed the trunk, Ethan turned back one last time. Here's another lesson for you, he said, his tone unyielding. The uniform isn't a license to throw your weight around. It's a responsibility, a duty to protect and serve, not to exploit and intimidate. Think about that if you're ever trusted with another chance. Redding's arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated shell of the man who had started the night with so much unwarranted confidence. He stood there, soaked to the bone, his gaze downcast, as the weight of Ethan's words and his own actions pressed down on him like the relentless rain. Ethan took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and stepped back toward his car. The events of the evening were a stark reminder of the work that lay ahead. Reforming a department marred by misconduct would be no small task, but moments like this gave him hope. Hope that accountability was possible, even in the face of systemic resistance. As he drove away, the rain beginning to let up, Ethan's resolve hardened. This wasn't just about Redding. It was about a culture of impunity that had been allowed to fester for far too long. And as he thought of the people who had suffered silently, he knew this was only the beginning. This story sheds light on the pervasive issue of systemic misconduct within law enforcement and the urgent need for accountability. It underscores the importance of empowering individuals to challenge abuses of power and demand justice, regardless of the odds. True reform begins with holding those in authority to the standards they pledge to uphold, protecting and serving with integrity. Let this story serve as a call to action for both citizens and leaders to advocate for transparency, fairness, and meaningful change within our justice system. Together, we can ensure that authority is wielded responsibly and that no one is above the law.